Okay, so this is going to be my second major response to researcher Neil Theise's book, Notes on Complexity. I'm a big fan of what this book is trying to do, but I also have some issues with it, and I want to articulate what those issues are and how we might approach solving them. Welcome to Every Crooked Branch, where we trace the jagged lines separating the material and the mystical and locate the sacred in the everyday. So the title of this video is All is One, but I Cannot Look, Scientifically Informed Spiritualities and the Flip Side of Fascination. And you should be able to find a link to the corresponding Substack article in the show notes below. But I want to begin by reading two quotes that showcase entirely different views with regard to the reactions that people can have towards grand visions of the cosmos, towards seeing the big picture. So here's the first quote. Complexity comforts us, revealing unequivocally, unavoidably, that however separate and alone we might feel, each one of us is, in each and every single moment, a pure expression of the entire living, conscious universe. Nothing separate, nothing left out, but true, pure, and complete, just as we are. And that was Neil Theise from Notes on Complexity, a scientific theory of connection, consciousness, and being. And here's the second quote. Anticipating Einstein, Schwarzschild had considered the hypothesis that the geometry of the universe was less like a three-dimensional box than something that could be twisted and deformed. In his article on the admissible curvature of space, he analyzed the possibility that we inhabited a semi-spherical universe, yielding a world that would turn in on itself like an Ouroboros. We would be faced with a fairyland geometry, a hall of mirrors whose horrifying perspectives would be more than the civilized mind could bear as it abhors and flees from all that it cannot comprehend. And that was from the novel When We Cease to Understand the World, which came out in 2020 by the author Benjamín Labatut. So in these quotes, we find two competing attitudes toward the dizzying vistas of space-time afforded by science. Is it soothing or terrifying to have a more complete picture of reality? What better captures the psychology of dealing with the big picture, the cosmic wonder of Indra's net or the cosmic horror of Cthulhu? This is going to be my second major video response to researcher Neil Theise's Notes on Complexity. It's a loving critique. It's not a takedown. It's only because his way of bridging science and spirituality is so deeply compelling that I wish to make its arguments more ironclad. If my own dissertation work on religiosity and environmentalism in England and America has shown me anything, it's that the project of making nature sacred must always involve a bit of shadow work. I wish that I could ask Theise a personal question. In your darker moments, does the infinitely dense network of causation between all things, as revealed by complexity theory, strike you as kaleidoscopic or phantasmagoric? Part 1. Everything is one, and you are one with all, and isn't that amazing? Contra the deterministic, machine-like worldview of the sciences of previous centuries, complexity theory, which didn't really kick off until the 1980s, supports the notion of creative and unpredictable emergence in the story of how complex systems evolve. Complex systems here meaning things like biological systems like embodied human persons, or entire human societies. The interactions between parts of such systems and between parts and the whole paints a much more delightful picture than Newton or Darwin ever gave us. Its lessons are not just scientific or mathematical, Theise tells the reader. Its lessons can also be deeply personal. Quote, complexity theory can foster an invaluable flexibility of perspectives and awaken us to our true, deep intimacy with the larger whole, so that we might return to what we once had, our birthright of being one with all. Our birthright of being one with all. Perhaps my own first experience of the interconnectivity between parts and wholes that Theise describes was the morning after my first ayahuasca ceremony. Contrary to expectation, apart from the minor purges of yawning and laughing, I didn't really experience a big purge that night. But the next morning, sitting outside the rented Airbnb, groves of redwoods towering above us, a friend of mine over-administered a dose of hape. And if you don't know, hape is a pulverized tobacco snuff that's blown forcefully, first into one nostril and then the other. Then the purging began in earnest. I was on my hands and knees, staring at my own vomit in the dirt, and I watched ants discovering it, and then columns of workers began to form to haul little chunks of it away. And as I was viewing this abject procession, the young man who had administered the dose began explaining to me that ants, in some cultures, are considered the teeth of the mother. That is, their job is to deconstruct matter. The material that I had ejected from my body, the inside and the outside of my bodily self thoroughly confounded as I stared at what just came out of me, right? That would become food for ants, and then building materials for other things, things that were not me. In other words, things that were not part of my egoic identification with my body. A true thou art that experience. So I was witnessing my ultimate place in the ecosystem, getting as much of an edifying as a horrifying preview of what would become of me after death. And at this ghastly realization, I was filled with a sense of existential vertigo, and I began heaving again until my gut was pretty much empty. So that morning delivered exactly the lesson that holistic visions of the cosmos promise to deliver. There is ultimately no firm boundary between self and other. You are continuous with everything. What you call you is only on loan. Bodily death will be a reunion. A lesson that can perhaps only be received on all fours in the dirt. The edification and the horror arrived together for me at that moment, and perhaps that's the only way the edification can arrive. One must be confronted in any discussion of oneness, and particularly when an author blends science and spirituality to give weight to a holistic vision, is the tendency to present such visions as marvels. Everything is one, and isn't that amazing? The social subtext of this tendency is that if we are sufficiently intelligent, sufficiently clear-eyed, we ought to be able to approach and to appreciate the inner workings of nature across scales of time and space that are normally far from pedestrian human consciousness. Awe is treated as the correct response to the idea of oneness, and any other response as a failure of nerve or a failure of imagination. In my younger days, I felt that if more people could sense, if only for a moment, the interconnection between all things, a picture of ecological harmony would become common property. A general sentiment of the importance of earthly care would take hold and eventually be reflected at the level of policy. Maybe, I thought, a holy sense of oneness might begin to pervade the commons, and people would talk and write more openly of an ultimate reality consisting not of some faraway heaven, but of the interdependence of all sentient beings and non-sentient things. And this new sense of a holy here and now would be entirely compatible with the ongoing revelations of new scientific research. Theise's book expresses this view wholeheartedly. The terminology of complexity theory gets us closer to expressing the ineffability of all is one. It sharpens a vaguely spiritual sense of interconnection that many have felt but have not known how to describe. And for those who must first be convinced by scientific means, complexity bestows a vocabulary for talking about interconnectedness. Terms like systems, self-organization, fractals, emergence, without the embarrassment of spirituality. Lyenda Lynn Hopt makes the case plainly in her 2021 book, Rooted: Life at the Crossroads of Science, Nature, and Spirit. Quote, doubters about the great aliveness of the wild earth, people who question their inner knowing, or those who simply have not experienced a personal connection with the more than human world, may be brought, through the certainty of scientific inquiry, to a new way of seeing. So many people have felt somewhere in their core a spiritual connection to nature, but have not had the language to ponder it deeply in our evidence-heavy overculture. The new science gives them this language and the essential courage to trust the intuition they have always possessed. End quote. It's not that I no longer find any of this moving. I still do, but I'm reminded of the 1960s flower child conviction that if only all world leaders took LSD together, all wars would end. Hopeful, but perhaps quite naive. Part 2. You are nature observing itself, but no part of nature observes itself in a detached manner. Personal and cultural attitudes to wholeness, to visions of an absolute, vary widely, as I hope to show here. In the modern West, the problem most often comes in when one tries to fit oneself into the picture of the whole. For the inner workings of nature include a truth that our culture conspires to cover up. The constant regeneration of material nature, which is necessary for new life, also means that you will die, since you are one little slice of nature observing itself. This is not death in the abstract sense, as when someone else dies. This is your bodily demise we're talking about. If you want to feel the electric current of being plugged into the universal flow, then death has to become personal, which means confronting the loss of everything dearest to you, including your own temporary existence as a separate being. This is, of course, hard to want. As Spinoza put it, quote, everything, insofar as it is in itself, endeavors to persist in its own being, end quote. Reconnection to the all is not just a joyous return. It always includes a vital loss. You. The particularity of you. For it is in the nature of love to hold on to the particular, some part that is elevated above the whole. And it is in the nature of the self, with its narcissistic investments, to hold on to, well, itself. All of this means that if death denial is an actual cultural psychological phenomenon, then grokking the big picture, of which you are a part and in which you will get crushed, means that many of the pictures of reality that scientific advancements frame for us are psychologically overwhelming. Annie Dillard said this perfectly in her 1999 book, For the Time Being. Quote, anyone's close world of family and friends comprises a group smaller than almost all sampling errors, smaller than almost all rounding errors, an invisible group at whose loss the world will not blink. More than 2 million children die a year from diarrhea and 800,000 from measles. Do we blink? Individuals blur. Journalists use the term compassion fatigue. What Ernest Becker called the denial of death is a kind of reality fatigue. Do you suffer this? End quote. Reality fatigue, psychological overwhelm in the face of the cosmic picture, is what Notes on Complexity does not address. The book does its utmost to paint for the reader a picture of their own emergence from impersonal forces, to convince them that their dissolution is nothing to fear, and that they should rightly feel, and are not alone in feeling, a sense of divine awe at the processes that resulted in everything the reader sees, including themselves. But Theise seems not to blink. Part 3. The role of individual temperament in seeing nature as divine. Pantheism, as the viewer may know, is the assertion that God and nature are one and the same. In the West, it has a formal philosophical lineage. Spinoza's Deus sive natura, God or nature, the two words naming one thing, and a long career as a heresy, since a God fully identical with the world is a God who cannot stand apart from it to judge, reward, or intervene. But the experience of the worldview that pantheism describes is what interests us here, and 20th century American nature writing provides ample first-person accounts of pantheistic experience. Ralph Waldo Emerson, crossing a bare Massachusetts common, becomes a transparent eyeball. I am nothing, I see all, the currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. John Muir's ecological vision in the Sierra Mountains leads him to write that when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. A realization of interconnection that then becomes imbued with sacred power. Everything turns into religion, writes Muir. All the world seems a church, and the mountains altars. Walt Whitman spends the length of Song of Myself, published in 1855, describing a rapturous interpenetration of body and environment, a roiling divinity of atoms passing promiscuously between one thing and the next, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Have you ever felt this, if only for a moment? A sense of interconnection between all things, yourself included? The ordinarily fragmented self plugged into something much grander? But nature, it seems, is not a category to which everyone wants to belong. And this is what is often missed by environmentalists who land anywhere on the religious secular spectrum. It may be the case that certain constitutions don't seem to be as open to or as desirous of the experience of receiving the universal being. Orientations to material environments may differ according to temperament. And for such folks, the transformation of mountains into altars will be resisted. Environmentalists, take note. Laws and regulations are obviously necessary, but in their explicitness, protective policies are conscious endeavors. And there are cultural and psychological forces that often act beneath the level of individual and collective awareness that we have to also find a way to address. And this is, of course, where education comes in. Theologian Mary Jane Rubenstein gives us an example of how to address this. In her 2018 book, Pantheologies, Gods, Worlds, Monsters, she places Walt Whitman side by side with his critic, D.H. Lawrence, as a template for contrasting these opposing temperaments or orientations to material nature. Famously, or infamously, Lawrence, in response to Whitman's ecstatic call to cosmic dilation in Song of Myself, quipped, "I don't want all those things inside me. Thank you." Rubenstein wants to emphasize certain gendered and racialized elements in Lawrence's disgusted rejection of Whitman, which she then links to a broader historical pattern of theologians' rejection of pantheism. So this next quote that I'm going to read is Rubenstein, and there are little fragments of D.H. Lawrence's original critique of Walt Whitman that are sort of scattered in this quote. Men, women, Brooklyn, bees. Whitman's pantheism makes him the feminine recipient of all of them, including, Lawrence bristles, an Eskimo and a kayak, little and yellow and greasy. At the same time as it is universally invaded, Lawrence suggests, Whitman's soul is also infinitely dispersed. The outside in is turned inside out. Thus, he imagines Walt promiscuously scattered into the dark limbs of Negroes, the vagina of the prostitute. End quote. This attitude, Rubenstein argues, stems from a fear of monstrosity and queerness. In other words, fear of category disruptions. The monster and the queer are those figures of our cultural imagination that are boundary crossers par excellence, confounding boundaries between male and female, human and non-human, inner and outer. Pantheism has been denigrated by theologians for centuries because it is monstrous and queer. That is, it blurs the boundary between God and world, between creator and creature, between transcendence and immanence. I don't at all disagree with Rubinstein, but the Lorentzian temperament does point to something practical. We do need an operating sense of separation from all things, simply to move about in the world. That separation between self and other has been useful at both evolutionary and everyday timescales. Oneness gums up your proprioceptive system. If you were constantly bowled over by the actuality of interconnected existence, feeling the currents of the universal being circulating through you, you'd eventually walk into traffic. Part 4. Awe-fulness. The mystical record is much stranger and much less comfortable than the reader of Emerson, Muir, or Whitman would suggest. Barbara Ehrenreich, a stalwart atheist, temperamentally the last person to want a mystical experience, describes a pre-dawn walk she took as a young woman in a small Colorado town in her book, Living with a Wild God, published in 2014. Quote, "The world flamed into life. How else to describe it? There were no visions, no prophetic voices or visits by totemic animals, just this blazing everywhere. Something poured into me, and I poured out into it. This was not the passive beatific merger with the all as promised by the Eastern mystics. It was a furious encounter with a living substance that was coming at me through all things at once. Ecstasy would be the word for this, but only if you are willing to acknowledge that ecstasy does not occupy the same spectrum as happiness or euphoria, that it participates in the anguish of loss and can resemble an outbreak of violence. As for trying to tell anyone else, should anyone ask where I had disappeared to at dawn, what would I have said? That I had been savaged by a flock of invisible angels, lifted up in a glorious flutter of iridescent feathers, then mauled, emptied of all intent and purpose, and pretty much left for dead?" End quote. This goes well beyond the sublimity of nature's vastness. It is closer to what Henry David Thoreau glimpsed on the slopes of Mount Katahdin, where that practicing American pantheist met a matter so ancient and indifferent that it stopped being scenery and turned on him. Quote, "I stand in awe of my body. This matter to which I am bound has become so strange to me. I fear not spirits, ghosts, of which I am one, that my body might, but I fear bodies. I tremble to meet them. What is this Titan that has possession of me? Talk of mysteries. Think of our life in nature, daily to be shown matter, to come in contact with it. Rocks, trees, wind on our cheeks, the solid earth, the actual world, the common sense. Contact, contact. Who are we? Where are we?" End quote. In Judeo-Christian thought, this ecstasy that is not happiness, this business of being savaged and mauled in the vicinity of the sacred, this fear and trembling when one is suddenly possessed by a Titan, is very old news. Exodus 20 records what happens when the Israelites hear the voice of God directly at Sinai. Thunder and lightning, smoke, the blast of trumpets. It is too much. They back away and beg Moses to stand between them and this terrible power. Quote, "Speak thou with us, and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die." End quote. The Israelites' request here is not for more revelation. It is for a mediator, a filter, to make God bearable. There is a theological term for exactly this near unbearableness of the sacred: Awe-fulness. Rudolf Otto coined the word in The Idea of the Holy, 1917, to name one half of what he called the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the encounter with a divine power that is wholly other and which simultaneously repels and attracts, that terrifies and fascinates in equal measure. Otto's insistence is that the numinous, which was his term for the felt proximity of this wholly other prior to any doctrine we might use to explain it, the numinous is not a pleasant feeling. It is a category of experience that often includes dread as a constitutive part. That which is completely impersonal or wholly other can be deeply affronting to an individual personality, whether this impersonal power is coded as God or nature. What Otto gives us is permission to say that that feeling of being affronted or assaulted, the dread, can be a part of the encounter with the sacred and not a failure to appreciate it properly. And this is the idea that I wish were more openly talked about amongst those who would speak of sacred nature. Part 5. When we cease to understand the world. The modern West has had its own recent reckonings with the awful, but we have tended to arrive at them by way of science rather than any kind of direct mystical encounter. Consider what geologist Charles Lyell did to the Victorian mind. 1830's Principles of Geology confronted Euro-American culture with the rumblings of deep time and revealed a terrible vastness that no one had asked to see. Its publishing, like Darwin's On the Origin of Species 29 years later, became a genuine crisis for Victorian intellectuals. Richard Holmes has dedicated no less than 2 books to understanding this crisis. The Age of Wonder from 2008, on a romantic generation that discovered the beauty and terror of science, and 2025's The Boundless Deep, which recovers the young Alfred Tennyson of doubt and dread from beneath his late Victorian respectability. Both of his books emphasize how human psychology, and with it human imagination, was remade by scientific progress. Tennyson read Lyell in 1833 and began drafting a poem he titled Two Voices, Thoughts of a Suicide, which he would work at on and off for the next decade. But by the time Lyell's Principles came out, Tennyson had already written The Kraken, a poem about a thing sleeping far, far beneath in the abysmal sea, which would in turn feed the imagery of H.P. Lovecraft's cosmic horror, particularly in The Call of Cthulhu. For people living through these intellectual upheavals, deep time did not produce serenity. It produced monsters at the bottom of the ocean. But the world of very small things, of extremely minute scales of space-time, can be just as bizarre, inhuman, and terrifying as the vastnesses opened up by geology and cosmology. Benjamín Labatut's When We Cease to Understand the World is a non-fiction novel that dramatizes the lives and discoveries of several major 20th century scientists and mathematicians, particularly those probing the quantum world. As Stefan Dial puts it, it is nominally about the history of science. It is actually about what happens to the human mind when it touches something it was never designed to comprehend. John Banville, reviewing it for The Guardian, called it a dystopian nonfiction novel. This sounds about right to me when we consider that Labatut's survey of the actual lives of the likes of Schwarzschild, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, and Grothendieck shows a certain mania at work, not as an unfortunate biographical coincidence, but as the price of admission into the strange new realities they were fortunate or unfortunate enough to glimpse. A quick word about the book's form, since the form is doing part of its argument. A literature PhD friend of mine read the book with a group of STEM scholars and reported that they felt betrayed by it. They had gotten most of the way through believing they were reading science history before realizing it was fiction. A confounding of facts, they said. A book that encourages misapprehension about science and scientists, they said. My friend was a little less disturbed, being trained, as most of us in humanities departments are, to distrust the dividing line between fact and fiction, and to attend instead to the mechanics of how a story is told, whatever kind of story it is. But the betrayal is worth noticing because it is perhaps the central effect the book performs on the reader. One of the ways we cease to understand the world is when we can no longer tell fiction from fact. Anyway, Chris Holmes, host of the New Books in Literature podcast, begins his interview of Labatut by questioning the author about the role he assigns mania, or mystical experience.
It is my great pleasure, and I wanted to start with a question about the main subject of your book, and that is the lives and discoveries of scientists. This is a work of fiction that takes on those lives, and those experiences are narrated through largely factual elements. You dramatize scientific discovery by the likes of Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Grothendieck as a form of madness or spiritual awakening. There are fevers, sicknesses, dreams and visions, and distortions of reality that end up with the groundbreaking discoveries of the last century. Why did you want to write about scientists as a kind of mystic?
Well, there's several reasons for that. The main one is that I am fascinated by mystics and mysticism, perhaps more than I am by science. I have sort of imposed my own interests, overlaid them. I'm using science as a method, as an excuse. I'm using ideas that come from very rational methods to point past that to territories where we all feel a little bit uneasy because they seem to point past what we can really understand. But I'm not really interested in madness. I am more interested in delirium. I think that it is delirium where the new comes from. I take these figures, and many of them, I have to also add, many of them actually went through these crises that I discovered. Not all of them, some of them. But I really believe that we're lived by powers that we don't understand. I think that the highest form of knowledge is possession, is not just thought. You're inhabited by something, or something within you suddenly stirs, and that really is what most of my writing is about. It's not madness, it's delirium and possession.
That claim that we are lived by powers we don't understand gives the narrative its overall shape, and a susceptibility to delirium runs through every one of its protagonists. Schwarzschild, writing to his wife from the Russian front on the same day he sent his famous solutions to Einstein's general relativity field equations, complains of something strange that has begun to grow inside him. I don't know how to name or define it, but it has an irrepressible force and darkens all my thoughts. It is a void without form or dimension, a shadow I can't see, but one that I can feel with the entirety of my soul. Heisenberg, having worked out his results in Helgoland, Germany, quote, had no idea how he had arrived at his results, but there they were, written in his own hand. If he was correct, science could not only understand reality, but begin to manipulate it at its most basic level. Heisenberg thought of the consequences knowledge of this nature might have, and was struck with a feeling of vertigo so profound that he had to restrain the impulse to throw his notebook into the sea. End quote. Schrödinger, quote, devoured the writings of Schopenhauer, through whom he came to know the philosophy of Vedanta. And then, in reference to Labatut's fictionalized account, earlier in the novel, of a nightmare Schrödinger had had about a horse being killed and torn apart by townspeople, the connection between the philosophy of Vedanta and his discoveries in quantum mechanics dawns on him. And he learned that the horrified eyes of the mutilated horse in the square were also the eyes of the policeman mourning its death. The teeth that had bit into the raw meat were the same that had champed at the grass in the hillside pastures, and that when the women had torn the immense heart from the animal's chest with their hands, it was their own blood that slathered their faces, because every individual manifestation is only a reflection of Brahman, the absolute reality that underlies the phenomena of the world. End quote. Note that this is the identical metaphysical claim Theise is making, but in Theise it consoles, and in Labatut it arrives in the form of a fever dream. Grothendieck, for his part, will say only that no one should suffer from his discovery, refusing to explain what he means when he speaks of the shadow of a new horror. And through Schwarzschild, Labatut's thesis is stated outright. Only a vision of the whole, like that of a saint, a madman, or a mystic, will permit us to decipher the true organizing principle of the universe. Part 6. The Bug in Holism. The problem of too muchness is remarked upon by Annie Dillard in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, which first came out in 1974. Dillard even-handedly addresses both the beauty and the terror of perceiving the natural world's sheer profusion of forms, and she claims that this too muchness is actually definitive of the material world, or at least of our relationship to it. Quote, "After the one extravagant gesture of creation in the first place, the universe has continued to deal exclusively in extravagances, flinging intricacies and colossi down aeons of emptiness, heaping profusions on profligacies with ever fresh vigor. The whole show has been on fire from the word go." End quote. To call it a show is, of course, to assume spectatorship, and indeed, Dillard is a keen witness to nature's profligacies. There is a layered gratuitousness to the ongoing creation of all that we see around us. First, there is what she calls an extravagance of minutia, in other words, sheer detail. Second, the fact that no witness to this extravagance is necessary for it to occur. All of which leads her to consider the mystery of the splintering vessels, a concept of Isaac Luria's, the modern exemplar of Jewish mysticism, or Kabbalah. Quote, "The words refer to the shrinking or imprisonment of essences within the various husk-covered forms of emanation, or time. The vessels splintered and solar systems spun, ciliated rotifers whirled in still water, and newts with gills laid tracks in the silk-bottomed creek. Not only did the vessels splinter, they splintered exceedingly fine. Intricacy, then, is the subject, the intricacy of the created world." End quote. Neil Theise also uses the work of Luria. His book Notes on Complexity discusses Lurianic Kabbalah as a conceptual map that lends an aura to complexity theory itself. He says, what is revealed is not two different natures of reality, science and religion, but one true nature, viewed through different languages and cultural frames. End quote. But one of the things I greatly appreciate about Dillard's Pilgrim is that the book's form is first half equals light, second half equals dark. Theise's is all light. Dillard notices a darkness moving within these extravagances, the sheer profusion and complexity of forms that ooze out of the processes of creation. At one point in the book's second half, she gazes back at the first half and writes, "I have been thinking that the landscape of the intricate world that I have painted is inaccurate and lopsided. It is too optimistic." End quote. For it's certainly the case, since miseries abound as well, and, as she writes, cruelty is a waste of pain, that this kaleidoscopic extravagance can turn blood red in a devilish mockery of intricacy into a rank fecundity that she dubs fixedness. And this is where Dillard formulates a kind of speculative biology that I think could complement Theise's ideas. Fixedness is her way of exploring the notion that eros, in other words, the driving force of biological life, and death are but flip sides of the same coin. Yes, she says, in complexity are the fringes of beauty, and in variety are generosity and exuberance. But this omits a crucial piece of the picture, and I think this is the same piece that gets left out of so many holistic visions, so many contemporary pictures of nature's sacredness. Quote, It is not one pine I see, but 1,000. I myself am not one, but legion, and we are all going to die. In this repetition of individuals is a mindless stutter, an imbecilic fixedness that must be taken into account. The driving force behind all this fecundity is a terrible pressure I must also consider. The pressure of birth and growth, the pressure that splits the bark of trees and shoots out seeds, squeezes out the egg and bursts the pupa, that hungers and lusts and drives the creature relentlessly towards its own death. End quote. This fecundity is dreadful, for the teeming evidence is that, as she writes, birth and growth, which we value, are ubiquitous and blind, that life itself is so astonishingly cheap, and that with extravagance goes a crushing waste that will one day include our own cheap lives. And one animal in particular is exemplary of this imbecilic fixedness, this mindless stutter of individual organisms incessantly birthing and dying. All this fecundity, Dillard writes, is what the sign of the insects says. And Benjamín Labatut has his own way of saying the same thing. In the sanatorium where a young and frustrated Schrödinger shuts himself away, he develops an obsession with a frail young girl who is wizened by years of proximity to death. One evening, this young Miss Erwig tells Schrödinger of her experience watching aphids hatch. Quote, "What was marvelous, but at the same time horrible about the process," the girl said, "was that these offspring would in turn produce offspring of their own after just a few hours of life. These new creatures were themselves gestating while still inside their mother. 3 generations were nestled, one inside the other, in a sort of dreadful Russian doll, a superorganism that embodied nature's tendency to overabundance." End quote. Insect life has long fascinated us. That is, in the older sense of the word fascination, referring to a mixture of attraction and repulsion. Marvelous, but at the same time horrible. 2010's Insectopedia is anthropologist Hugh Raffles' book-length meditation on this cross-cultural human fascination with insects. He once noticed, while standing before a case of pinned insects, that if you watch people going from case to case around the room, you see right away that many of these objects possess intense psychic power. Despite death, they enter our bodies and make us shiver with apprehension. What other animal has this power over us? In a more lyrical passage, Raffles enumerates the different kinds of nightmares that insects have an unmatched power to give us. Quote, "There is the nightmare of fecundity and the nightmare of the multitude. There is the nightmare of uncontrolled bodies and the nightmare of inside our bodies and all over our bodies. There is the nightmare of unguarded orifices and the nightmare of vulnerable places, swarming, crawling, burrowing." End quote. The spiritual pilgrim Dillard, watching Luna moths mate, records that it was the perfect picture of utter spirituality and utter degradation. I was fascinated and could not turn my eyes away. Sometimes nature documentaries can double as horror films. We see in them an appalling amorality. But nowhere is this more the case than when we watch insects going about their daily business. Now, let's hold up all of this material against Notes on Complexity and ask a simple question. Where is it? Where are the aphids and the mating Luna moths and the nightmare of unguarded orifices? This is the ultimate irony of any holistic vision. In order to be whole, it has to leave something out. Theologian and nature writer Belden Lane uses the term syrupy nature mysticism to describe visions of oneness that leave no room for darkness. Quote, "Part of the problem is that theologians find it hard to escape the rigid dualism of sacred and profane, subject and object, nature and supernature. Poets, on the other hand, can more easily think beyond such limits, reaching, as they do, for mythic wholeness. Yet theirs can be the tendency toward a shallow monism in which God, the world, and the self rollick in a syrupy nature mysticism. How does one learn to esteem the commonplace without resorting to apotheosis? End quote. That last question is the one I would put to Theise. For in striving toward mythic wholeness, even when, or maybe especially when, science is used as a tool to promote a vision of the all, Theise delivers on the sublime, but he stops short at the abject. And perhaps we can level an even more serious charge. Julia Kristeva argues that religions are, at bottom, so many techniques for purifying the abject. In other words, for cleansing the sacred so that it can be safely approached, handled, and lived with. If that is right, then despite his explicit attempt to blend the cosmologies of many different established religions, modern spirituality and science into a kind of single non-sectarian vision, Theise could be considered a thoroughly religious writer. That is, he is trying to cleanse the sacred of its terrible power so that his reader may approach it and live with it. Old map makers would write the expression "Hic sunt dracones," here be dragons, at the edge of the known world. Theise's map has no such edge, and therefore no dragons. And I don't think this is because he's traveled further than the old map makers, but because the dragons have been expelled in advance. Complexity can entrance us. Swirling, intense, beautiful, patterned. But the line between the kaleidoscopic and the phantasmagoric is thin, and a holism that keeps to the kaleidoscopic side has been edited. Part 7. A cacophony, not a chorus. So, is holism wrong? I want to say no, but the palatable version, the version that says good vibes only, probably is. And so I want to end by gesturing toward the version that I find that I can still believe in, which is expressed in Labatut's non-fiction novel, When We Cease to Understand the World. And I must say here that I have ceased to understand the world. That is, this phrase, the world. What or where is this supposed totality exactly? The mistake with any philosophical system, any metaphysics whatsoever, any cosmology or worldview, would be its assumption of universality, any way of looking that claims to see everything. Donna Haraway calls this the God trick, the notion that there really is a view from nowhere, a completely neutral position that transcends any particular perspective. Philosophers studying the nature of experience, phenomenologists, will tell you that the world is less an actual place than a field of experience, and is therefore a matter of perspective, since any experience is necessarily gained through occupying a particular perspective. The world, this phrase, the world, is what is given in experience. So ceasing to understand the world is a good thing. It's actually the beginning of understanding. One must first discover just how provincial their world is. So if the world, that is to say, this fantasy of objectivity, if the world can only ever be an ideal object, a virtual thing, then what would universality or objectivity consist of? One answer has already been given to us through Nietzsche, and long before him through the Taoist philosopher Chuang-Tzu. Now, I can't say how familiar Labatut is with these figures, but their same perspectivist concept of objectivity is something that we can also find in his novel, specifically through his reimagining of the mathematician Grothendieck's intellectual history. A perspective is by nature limited, Labatut has Grothendieck write. Quote, It offers us one single vision of a landscape. Only when complementary views of the same reality combine are we capable of achieving fuller access to the knowledge of things. End quote. The closest thing to the ideal of objectivity is, then, all perspectives combined. But will we ever achieve a convocation of all the voices that have ever existed, including those of the more than human world? Will my ears ever come close to hearing that complete chorus? Of course not. And it wouldn't be a chorus if I could. It would be a cacophony. But we can imagine it. And that compounding of perspectives, a single place where all beings meet. Maybe we can call it the Star Wars Cantina fantasy. It would be simultaneously the height of objectivity and the height of earthly divinity. Not the God trick, but the real deal. And that, I think, is a holistic vision worth entertaining. And it's worth entertaining precisely because it would be a cacophony. It wouldn't resolve into anything beautifully coherent, and it would not necessarily comfort. Its extravagances would likely overwhelm. You would idealize it, but then you would step back from it and plead to Moses to stand between it and you. It would strive to be as total as possible, finding room for the reaction of disgust at the spawning aphids, the void without form or dimension that Schwarzschild felt darkening all his thoughts. And it would include your own death, all the things that we vainly wish nature did not produce. The poet Rilke once wrote, "Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror." Neil Theise writes, "Complexity comforts us." Well, there's Rilke's beauty, but for the sake of completeness, for Rilke's terror, he would have to give me the fairyland geometry and the hall of mirrors too, all of that too muchness. At least then, my civilized mind would flee from me, and Ehrenreich's angels can commence their mauling. For God's sake, give me the teeth of the mother. At least then, I know I'm getting an unfiltered view.